Harry Enton got himself in all sorts of trouble yesterday for pointing out the obvious. He had a piece over at CNN pointing out the early signs are very good for the GOP in 2022. He says President Joe Biden's first 2.5 months in office have been far better received than former President Donald Trump's. Biden's been able to maintain an approval rating north of 50%, yet a look at the data also reveals that Biden's Democratic Party has likely not picked up any support since the election. If historical trends hold, Democrats are likely going to face a rough political environment in the midterms. One of the best ways to judge the political environment is through the generic congressional ballot. The generic ballot asks respondents some form of the following question. If the elections for Congress were held today, would you vote for the Democrats or the Republicans? Democrats are ahead on that measure by about 4 points in the average poll taken since the beginning of Biden's administration. That lead is about the same as the final margin in the 2020 presidential race and in the 2020 House popular vote. This tends to line up with what we have seen in terms of party identification. Remember, the 2020 polls tended to underestimate the Republican position, which means Republicans are actually doing better on the generic ballot now than they were heading into the 2020 election. Additionally, the types of voters who will be casting a ballot in 2022 will likely be more favorably disposed to the GOP than the overall voting population. The reason is that when there's a Democrat in the White House, Republicans have a turnout advantage. A study I did back in 2018, says Harry Enton, who's formerly of 538, reveals that voters who turned out in midterms with Democratic presidents were more Republican-leaning than registered voters at large in every single midterm since 1978. On average in these midterms, the gap between the registered voter and the actual electorate had been about 5 points more Republican among the actual electorate. Just applying that shift to the polling now, it's not hard to imagine that Republicans may already have an advantage with the voters who will turn out next year. Of course, it's possible the cycle could be different. It's likely, however, there will be some movement toward the Republicans in the national political environment between now and next November. The party not in control of the White House has done worse in the national House vote than they were doing on the generic ballot at this point in 12 of 14 midterm elections for which we have polling at this point. The only exceptions were 1974, when Democrats already had a large lead, and 2002, when polling didn't take into account September 11th. Once you control for who controls the White House, there's a surprisingly strong correlation between the generic congressional ballot 19 months before the midterm elections and the eventual House results. If trends hold, the likely national House result in 2022, given the current generic ballot, is Republicans winning by between 4 and 5 points. So it would be a historical anomaly for Republicans not to win back the House in the next election cycle. Right? So this notion that Democrats are always and forever going to be on the move here is just not true, in the same way that it was not true in 2008. After Barack Obama won a sweeping victory. And you can tell the Democrats are starting to run scared here. One of the ways that you can tell the Democrats are starting to run scared is that Joe Biden is now backing off of his own push for MLB to move the All-Star Game. So you remember, he went on ESPN with the reporter Sage Steele, and Sage asked him about, by the way, she put out a tweet saying she disagreed with him on this. So just worth noting, Sage Steele asked him, should MLB move the All-Star Game? He said, I would back that. Well, now that Stacey Abrams was pointing out to Joe Biden and company that you just alienated a huge percentage of Georgians with this nonsense. Now Biden's trying to back off of it. According to Politico, when Biden was asked last week what he thought of Major League Baseball moving its All-Star Game, he told ESPN he would strongly support them doing that. On Friday, the league announced it would hold the game elsewhere, and by the way, invoked Biden in their actual press release. Asked during the briefing whether Biden supported the league's decision, Psaki reread Biden's remarks and distanced the president from the boycott. She said he wasn't dictating what Major League Baseball should do. He supports them being able to make that decision. Okay, that is just revisionist history. The Democrats might be starting to realize that it's a bad idea to be this crazy. They might be beginning to realize that there will be a backlash to all of this. And by the way, the backlash might be much stronger in terms of both the law and in terms of politics than anybody on the left is willing to contemplate. One of the areas of backlash could theoretically be going after Facebook, Twitter, and Google. Justice Clarence Thomas had a concurrence in a recent Supreme Court case on Monday, in which the Supreme Court vacated a lower court ruling in finding that President Trump had acted unconstitutionally by blocking people on Twitter. That case, which the justices deemed moot, hinged on the idea that the Donald Trump account was a public forum run by the President of the United States. In his concurrence, Justice Thomas agreed with the decision that the case was moot because Trump is no longer president. But he argued that Twitter's recent ban of Trump's account suggests it's the platforms themselves, not the government officials on them, that hold all the power. So in other words, if you are going to treat Donald Trump's Twitter account as though it is a public utility, you have to treat all of Twitter like it's a public utility. Thomas wrote, as Twitter made clear, the right to cut off speech lies most powerfully in the hands of private digital platforms. The extent to which that power matters for purposes of the First Amendment and the extent to which that power could lawfully be modified raise interesting and important questions. Thomas said some digital platforms basically ought to be treated like common carriers. Thomas says a traditional telephone company laid physical wires to create a network connecting people. Digital platforms lay information infrastructure that can be controlled in much the same way. Thomas argued that while private companies aren't subject to the First Amendment, common carriers are unique in that they don't have the right to exclude. He suggests that large tech platforms with substantial market power should be bound by the same restrictions. He says if the analogy between common carriers and digital platforms is correct, an answer may arise for dissatisfied platform users who would appreciate not being blocked, laws that restrict the platform's right to exclude. So Thomas is overtly now stumping for Republicans to pass a law, maybe with some Democrats, that basically say that Twitter and Facebook and Google can no longer exclude people on the basis of political bent. Thomas describes the sheer scope of Facebook and Google's market power, citing Facebook's 3 billion users and Google's 90% market share in search. He says it changes nothing that these platforms are not the sole means for distributing speech or information. A person could always choose to avoid the toll bridge or train and instead swim the Charles River or hike the Oregon Trail. But in assessing whether a company exercises substantial market power, what matters is whether the alternatives are comparable. For many of today's digital platforms, nothing is. Thomas said that it wouldn't be a court that does this. He said that it would be a legislature that does this. But he says we'll soon have no choice but to address how our legal doctrines apply to highly concentrated, privately owned information infrastructures such as digital platforms. Here's the bottom line. The backlash is coming. It's going to come strong. People on the right are not going to sit by for this stuff. They are not. They're not going to sit by and watch Joe Biden unilaterally redraw the lines of division and demarcation between the government and the individual. They're not going to sit by and watch social media redraw the lines of the First Amendment. They're not going to sit by and watch Democrats redraw the nature of American freedom of association and freedom of speech. They're not going to do any of that. And they're not going to go along with the corporations that go along with this. There will be a backlash. The backlash is coming. And I am pleased to see that backlash coming because nothing could be more timely than a massive backlash against the wild leftist overreach we are currently seeing. Facts don't care about your feelings, and it's a fact that The Ben Shapiro Show is the largest conservative podcast in the nation. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on all of our content.